Let's talk about the guy that I know you've been wanting to talk about. Zyhir Hope, you mentioned, is the number one Dodgers prospect. Josue DePaul is number two. Dalton Rushing is number three. Let me start by asking a question that's not specific to Hope. Um, I imagine it's these three and then a pretty steep drop off to number four. How close were these three for you? And maybe it's not a drop off. You can correct me if I'm wrong there.
Jackson Ferris is not that far
Okay.
behind Rushing on
Wow.
the 101. All four of them are, I'm pretty sure all four of them are in the top 50.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we have Ferris and Rushing with the same OFP grade. We both have them as OFP 60s, which is generally... This year, there were less OFP 60s than normal, but it's something like the top 50 or 60 prospects, the way that we grade. We have Hope and DePaul with 70s. 70s are usually the top 15, 20, 25 prospects. So you can kind of get a... Whoops, I just hit my own... hit my camera there. So you can kind of get a sense of where those guys are going to... Hope and DePaul are, if you've been following me on Twitter, reading anything I've written, anything Jeffrey's written, you're not going to be surprised to learn that Hope and DePaul are really high up on our 101. They're very, very, very good prospects in a time period where there really aren't that many great prospects, which is a whole discussion. It's not even clear to me whether there's not great prospects or we just found guys' flaws a lot better, right? But these are two of the best outfield prospects in the entire sport. Rushing, if you count him as a catcher, is one of the 2 or 3 best catching prospects in the entire sport. And Ferris is one of the top, 5 left-handed pitching prospects, 6. You also get do you count Jack Caglione as a left-handed pitcher? I actually lied. Ferris is just outside the top 50. I had to look that up. But he's right there. There's not a huge gap between Rushing and Ferris. That entire part of the list is kind of flat. To me, the gap would probably be after Ferris. Down towards Alex Freeland in terms of skill. And Alex Freeland's also going to make the 101.
Well, talk to me about Hope, because he's a guy that clearly people are pretty fired up around the sport about.
So he's a guy who, dating back to even before the draft, he was like a sleeper. He was a guy who didn't get a ton of showcase circuit buzz, but had some really cool athletic traits out of a Virginia high school. Signed for mid 6 figures in the 11th round. It has been widely rumored that the Cubs basically snatched him from the Dodgers, that the Dodgers were also planning on giving him a high bonus in the 11th round. They then immediately traded for him in the Michael Busch trade. We had gotten huge reports on him out of Instructs even before the trade in the Cubs system. We ranked him pretty highly in what was a pretty stacked Cubs system last offseason. I think he was in the next 10, but the Cubs put 9 guys on the 101. So that was still on the 101 long list as an 11th round draft pick. And then he went to A-ball this year. He blew out his shoulder and missed a couple of months. He did the Michael Conforto, injuring his shoulder on his swag. I guess Corbin Carroll did that too. But he got about 250 plate appearances, plus he got about 100 more in the Arizona Fall League. And given that he was 19 years old and considered a guy who had some hit tool questions, he basically had the best teenage batted ball statistics relative to the age and league context of anybody in the minor leagues out of teenagers. Yeah, it was absolutely nuts. He had well above average in-zone contact, which is the best measure that we have for hit tool projection from an analytic perspective. He had well above average 90th percentile in average exit velocity, which is, again, the best power metrics we have. And he had near elite chase rate. So he projects to hit for power, hit for contact, and has really good swing decisions. He's also, just if you watch him, he's super duper athletic. He's got killer bat speed. He runs fast. I don't know that he's going to stick in center necessarily because they, as we discussed before, they've got a lot of potential outfield prospects, and he might not be the one that sticks in center, but he's got a chance. His defensive instincts aren't great. he was a significant pitching prospect in
Yeah.
high school as well. So he's got like a 70 arm just for, on top of it all. There were teams that liked him better off of the mound than as a hitter coming out of high school. He was probably going to play two ways. I believe he was a UNC commit if he had went to college. So he saw like huge gains across the board and just like everything's there. It looks right. If you pull TrackMan data on him, his TrackMan data is incredible for his age. The only part that's not right is he was an 11th round draft pick a year and a half ago. So you don't have like the long history of dominance on the showcase circuit like a Max Clark or a Walker Jenkins, who are the top outfield prospects in that draft class. But I've said this, I did a thread on this about Twitter recently. I think he's a very comparable prospect at this stage to Jenkins. And if you solely look at the 2024 analytics, he's probably a better prospect. Now, again, the history matters, all that stuff. As we'll talk about with Cartaya, you can get fooled by 350 plate appearances in the low minors. It's not impossible. Yeah. The pitching does get a lot harder once you get out of specifically Rancho Cucamonga, which is not a particularly difficult place to hit the ball. So there's some risk there that, he's going to have some hit tool regression. But this is a very similar rise to another prospect that I was very high on very early last year, Roman Anthony in the Boston Red Sox system. I noted like a month and a half into his minor league season that his batted ball data was off the charts in 2023. And Anthony's a consensus top 2 or 3 prospect. I'm not going to spoil whether he's one on our list or not, but he's one on other people's lists. He's certainly a very strong candidate along with Dylan Cruz to be number 1 on this global list. And Hope is basically at the same spot that Anthony was about a year ago. And that's probably a spoiler for around where he is on the 101 too, because Anthony was in the top 10 last year. So
okay, duly noted. Talk to me briefly about DePaula, because he's kind of like sort of both of these guys are very similar in the sense that there is a lot of projection, less to do. They're not Dalton Rushing, who might be a major leaguer, like on opening day theoretically. So what separates DePaula and Hope, and how do those two compare?
Almost not. I'm just going to straight out spoil this. They are one spot apart on our 101. There is very little separating them. DePaula hits the ball on the ground more right now. He does not lift his hardest contact. He also has a much longer history of he has a similar power, contact, swing decision profile, and he has a longer history and has held it together at the high A level. Those are the things that he has over Hope. The flip side of that is that some of it's still projection because he's not lifting his hardest contact yet, which is how you end up with a higher on-base percentage and a slugging percentage, which is not like super ideal for a guy that's got like 70 raw power. You would hope that's not the case. But again, as we've said multiple times, the Dodgers are very good at getting these guys to lift their hard contact eventually.
Yeah. Okay, let me ask you about a couple other names on the top 10, and then we'll let you go. Again, this is Jarrett Seidler of Baseball Prospectus. You can check out his stuff on Baseball Prospectus. You can purchase the Baseball Prospectus book, which will be out in the next few weeks. We had a super chat from Doom Sal, who asked about a guy I wanted to ask you about. He said, good evening. How did Baseball Prospectus come up with Eric Swan as the number 8 prospect in the Dodger system? Thank you. Swan, if you're unfamiliar, is not a guy that you are going to find on many top 10s. Now, your guys' top 10 is kind of out earlier, so there might be some other lists that when they are published will be there. But this is a fun one for me because I've heard the name. I went and looked it up, and I'm looking, I say, okay, here's a guy with a 5.7 ERA in low A last year after being the 137th pick in 2023. And I'm like, and he's one spot ahead of River Ryan, a guy that everybody that's watching this show is very familiar with. And you have him 8th. Now, I want to say one other thing, which is the Dodgers top 10 list is sort of a composite. It's not one person's list. There's input from some folks. You had maybe less direct input in where he ranked in the Dodgers list. So all the caveats aside, give me your thoughts on Eric Swan. Again, number 8 in the Dodger system.
So this is a Jeffrey Paternostro ranking more than me. However, I agree with it. If I didn't agree with it, it probably wouldn't have went up, and I would also not give the conviction that I'm about to give. So Eric Swan Missed most of the year with various arm injuries, and then went to the Arizona Fall League. Now, the Arizona Fall League's a StatCast league, so we have the real good pitch metrics on him. This guy's throwing upper 90s with like 2+ breaking balls, like a hard gyro slider, cutterish type of thing that's in like the high 80s, and then like this incredible sweeper with just tons of sweep. This is pure stuff. We have a very good idea now. You look at Stuff Plus type metrics. We have a very good idea, especially with fastballs and breaking balls, what pitches are good and what pitches are going to be good someday. And high 90s with good fastball carry and like a really hard gyro slider shape and like a pretty good velocity sweeper with a lot of sweep is just that. Those are this is what very good pitching prospects that come on late look like right before they come on. He could continue to get hurt. He could continue to have horrible command problems, but obviously Nick Frasso was this type of guy a couple of years ago, another guy that the Dodgers traded for with very little pro experience and kind of a small minor trade. And obviously he's had bad shoulder injuries. He had elbow injuries, and he had bad shoulder injuries more recently. Ryan's gotten hurt. Kyle Hurt got hurt. Kyle Hurt was another one of these guys who was a huge stuff monster, and then eventually it got there. So this is a situation where we're looking at pitch metrics. We're not looking at performance. Jeffrey also saw him in Arizona and agreed with the pitch metrics. And we're looking at the pitch metrics. These are the pitch metrics of a guy who's going to be really good, and we're not really waiting for the strikeout to walk ratio in AA yet. We're trying to get ahead of that and predict what players are going to be good more than what players were good in the minors last season.
Yeah.
So that's one.
Okay. And I mean, 6'6", and I believe he's a guy who just started pitching in 2022.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. He's a converted college infielder from Middle Tennessee State. For that guy to get drafted in the 4th round at all, the stuff has to be incredible, especially by a team like the Dodgers, who is not prone to just like randomly drafting guys. This was a guy who was on our radar before the draft last season, who was on our radar in spring training, and then it was like, darn, he's been hurt all the year. But even when he showed up, it was still upper 90s with these two great breaking balls, and they showed up in the Arizona Fall League, looked pretty healthy. Still walked the ballpark, which isn't like, so, he didn't pitch particularly well in the Arizona Fall League. He also only pitched 3 games out there in short appearances. But these were on the type of cameras where we can say, okay, this is really premium stuff. If this is really premium stuff, he had thrown strikes and pitched the whole season. This is the type of guy who would be, in the top half of the 101. He's not in the top half of the 101. He's a decent chunk off of the 101. But if he comes out and throws 50 great, healthy innings at the beginning of next season, he's going to be there pretty quickly just because the stuff is so good.
Let me ask you about one more player on the list and then get your thoughts on maybe one guy who, if in your opinion, maybe you would have liked to see on this list. I want to ask about Alex Freeland. I know this isn't necessarily the sexiest name on this list. There's a couple other international free agent signings that a lot of people are really high on. Freeland is interesting to me, and I think a lot of people watching, because he technically plays shortstop and he's close-ish to the major league level for a team that doesn't necessarily seem to have a long-term plan at shortstop right now. Is Alex Freeland potentially a long-term plan at shortstop for the Dodgers?
That's probably a little bit of a stretch.
Right.
He's got a shot to stick at shortstop. I'm not sure look, if Mookie Betts wants to play shortstop for like the next 3 or 4 years, they're probably just going to keep playing Mookie Betts at shortstop, right? And I know he's expressed the desire to play the shortstop position. Is Freeland capable of running out there and being an average defensive shortstop and above average defensive shortstop? Yeah, he is. Is it more likely that he's going to be one of these versatile super utility type players, more in like the Chris Taylor, Kike Hernandez role? Yeah, I think that's probably a little bit more likely for him. But yeah, he has a shot to be a the 2026 opening day shortstop. That's certainly not out of the question. A lot of these guys, he's not a small guy, he's a bigger guy. This is kind of like the body type that typically we associate more with like a third baseman, a second baseman than a shortstop. But he's got some athleticism, and he's he's kind of like one of these, the sum of the parts is greater than any individual part.
Yeah.
Like if you pull like a TrackMan readout, it's not like there's like nothing super standout here. He's got a lot of like average, above average tools. The Dodgers have done a really good job maximizing these players and putting them in a chance to succeed, and giving them some time to develop. Freeland was a 3rd-round pick. He did not hit much at all in 2023, which was his first full pro season. But they gave him a chance, and he ran it back, and he moved through 3 levels. I don't think he's going to be like a huge power hitter or anything like that, but he's got a chance to be like one of these, 260, 270 hitters, some walks, some power, plays, defense at 3, 4, 5 different spots. Just a really nice player. Again, the type of which the Dodgers have both had a lot of and gotten a lot of utility out of. Is he really like the long-term answer at shortstop for a team that's planning on being the best team in baseball over the next decade? I'm a little more skeptical than that, but he made huge gains last year, and it's possible that those continue in 2025. It's not completely out of the question.
Okay, I'm going to ask you about Cartaya before we go, but one other question before we get to him. And I'll phrase this 2 different ways, and I'll open the scope of who you want to talk about here. Is there a guy, because you've mentioned, and I saw somebody with the super chat asking what the 101 is. The 101 is Baseball Prospectus's top 101 prospects across baseball. You put that list together, and then you have a bunch of other folks that sort of help contribute to that and help contribute to these top 10. So it's not necessarily always apples to apples. So when you're kind of evaluating prospects across the sport, and so when you look at the Dodgers top 10, is there either a guy that you is in the back half of the top 10 that you like maybe more than the people who put that list together, or is there a guy that's not even on the top 10 that you're sort of bullish on?
I'll give you the answer to both of those. I would probably have had Kyle Hurt higher on this list. I know he's gonna miss most or all of next season because he had Tommy John mid 2024. And the argument to have him lower in an ordinal ranking is he's already 26 and he's gonna miss most of the season. So we're talking about a guy who's probably not going to be established in the majors until he's 27, even 28. But if you throw him into a stuff model, he returns values as one of the top pitching prospects in the entire sport. The problem is he just didn't pitch much last year, isn't going to pitch much at all next year, and may not. Then what are you counting on a 27, 28-year-old Kyle Hurt to be a rotation piece with no real evidence other than like his numbers in AA in 2023? So I get it from that perspective, but he's also the type of guy who could just pop up and be really good out of nowhere, perhaps in one of these offshoot type roles, perhaps not as a 140, 160 inning starter. The guy that was way out of the top 10 that I absolutely adore as a prospect is Hyun-Suk Jang, the pitcher that they signed out of the KBO. I think before last season. Yeah, it might have been. It was like fall 2023 or something like that. Huge kid, throws really hard, has really great pitch shapes, with the world in the complex and low A. He was also establishing himself in the United States. He was moving over from Korea. He certainly had some adjustment issues at times. There were balls just like flying to the backstop at times. But this is another thing like Swan, and obviously he's further away. His command is a huge problem. Swan's is a minor problem. Jang's is a huge problem. But this is a guy who, if he gets to even like below average command, has like top of the rotation or top end closer potential. Wow. That's a reach right now for him. But if he starts throwing strikes, and you can say this about plenty of guys, this is a guy who could be really high up on lists as soon as next year. This is like a guy who, like, if you're like in like a 500 prospects or own fantasy league or something like that, is like an interesting guy to have shares, and actually traded for him in a league that rosters like 1,000 prospects
Oh
or
my
something
gosh.
like that. Yeah, it's a crazy league. But yeah. He was already owned at the point at which I traded for him, right? So yeah, that's the league I play in. But yeah, he's got huge stuff, which again, for us to, in a very deep farm system, put him in the top 20 over somebody like Maddox Bruns, who was a first round pick, and is certainly a higher profile prospect. We really like that stuff profile.
Yeah. Okay. I love it. Last question, we'll get you out of here. You wrote about this today. Diego Cartaya. This is a guy that, I'll never forget reading Keith Law, and Keith Law saying Diego Cartaya one day might be a top 5 prospect in all of Major League Baseball. I don't know that Keith Law was alone in having that belief. This is a guy that people were super high on, and then he just hit a wall. And over the last couple of years has not been able to figure it out, to the point that the Dodgers have DFA'd him. He's still technically a Dodger for a couple of days, could potentially get moved. Give me your thoughts on what happened with Cartaya. Do you think there's still value in a player like this? Anywhere you want to take this?
So yeah, Keith had him as high as 6th. The lowest ranking I could find before the 2023 season was that Fangraphs had him 28th. So everybody had him between 6th and 28th, which is not a huge gap. There was nobody that had like Cartaya in like the 70s, the 80s, not on a list. Everybody agreed this guy was a top global prospect. He absolutely crushed the ball at low A. Huge average exit velocity, good contact, good plate discipline. So this was not just like wow, this guy looks really great in the uniform and has a really pretty swing. He also looked really great in the uniform and had a really pretty swing. So like everything lined up, he absolutely crushed the ball. Then he starts going up levels and the performance starts falling apart and the underpinnings start falling apart. He stops hitting the ball hard. His contact continues to regress. His swing doesn't have, the elasticity going through the zone. He wasn't able to correct his barrel path and aim his barrel path at the pitches he was seeing. The pitchers just get better as levels go up. So he started swinging and missing a lot. He started chasing outside the zone a little bit more. That was never really a super strength of his. The walk rates were kind of high because pitchers were afraid to pitch to him more than anything. Like he was that kind of imposing presence in the low minors. Since he got to AA, just hasn't hit at all, which has been 2 straight years now. They put him in AAA, and it was a complete catastrophe last year. Defensively, he was always like a maybe to stick behind the plate. And unlike some of the other maybes that the Dodgers have had, like Will Smith, for example. Will Smith was a guy who in the minor leagues played a significant amount of infield. A lot of people thought he was going to be like a third baseman or a right fielder or something like that, a second baseman. And instead, he's turned into a pretty good defensive catcher, especially in terms of receiving. Cartaya's receiving never really improved. So you've got a guy who was iffy to catch in the majors, was going to have to be driven by his bat. And over the last 2 years, there's just like been no sign of life in his bat. Catchers are really weird. Catchers stagnate sometimes offensively due to the physical and mental rigors of the position. John Sickles noted that decades ago, and it remains true. He called it young catcher offensive stagnation syndrome, and it's something that I think is probably what happened to Cartaya, because there's I can't point to a single individual thing with Cartaya to say, okay, his swing got really messed up. Okay, he started chasing every curveball he saw. It was just kind of a gradual, moderate deterioration that turned into a fast deterioration and left him without a whole lot of, underlying skills to fall back on. I wouldn't be surprised if especially a bad team takes a shot on him just because he was a consensus top 30 prospect so recently. That you might as well, and he's got options left too. It's not like you have to roster him on the major league roster. You might as well just give him another swing in AA or AAA under your organization and try and get some of, if there's, maybe some kind of swing change your coaches see. I don't see an obvious swing change. To me, his swings pretty much remain the same the entire time, but I'm also not a professional hitting instructor, so it's entirely possible there's an obvious swing change and I just didn't see it. maybe there's a swing change, maybe there's an approach change, maybe you just think that getting him into a lower pressure environment where he doesn't have the tag that people used to call him a top 25 prospect is going to cause him to thrive. I would be surprised if he remains in the Dodgers system. I think at least somebody's going to give him a claim off of waivers. You know, his options left, and he can serve as the third or fourth catcher on your 40-man roster while, you know, you're trying to develop him. I was not that surprised that he moved out of the Dodgers system. They've got an enormous amount of catching depth up and down the system. You know, Rushing's going to end up playing the outfield just because they don't have anywhere else to, you know, they've got Will Smith signed for 9 more years or something like that.
It's a sore subject around some parts nowadays after the second half he had last year, you know?
Sure, but he's still, you know, he's in, you know, Austin Barnes is still around, and maybe Rushing ends up taking some time behind the plate eventually, but like they don't need to have Cartaya as like a fourth or fifth catcher on the 40-man roster. And, you know, I mentioned this in the piece, but the two players that the Dodgers did not promote as aggressively as you would think when they were top prospects and when they were hitting were Cartaya and Miguel Vargas. It's entirely possible the Dodgers knew these guys weren't as good as where we were ranking them, right?
Yeah.
We opened up this segment by talking about how good the Dodgers were at scouting other organizations. Presumably, they're also really good at scouting themselves. So one of the things I looked back in the piece at BP and tried to find retrospective red flags, and one of the red flags was that the Dodgers sent him back to low A at the beginning of the 22 season, even though he crushed the ball there at the 21 season. Maybe they weren't as high on him as the industry was.
Yeah.